The prostitution system established by the Nazis was one of the many forms of extreme exploitation that marked the horror of the Third Reich. In the concentration camps, brothels were created under the appearance of incentives for certain prisoners, but in reality they were another mechanism of subjugation. Women arbitrarily selected in Ravensbrück and other camps were forced to provide service in these spaces, where the surveillance of the SS ensured their complete submission. However, the instrumentalization of sex by Nazism was not limited to the camps. During the occupation of France, brothels such as Le Chabanais were exclusive to the elite of the Reich, becoming symbols of power and decadence. While Nazi propaganda promoted racial purity, officials such as Hermann Göring indulged in unrestricted excesses. Within the party itself, homosexuality was used both to cover up and to purge political enemies, as in the case of Ernst Röhm. From exploitation in the camps to hypocrisy within the Nazi leadership, sex became a tool of control, subjugation and power within the most ruthless regime of the 20th century. Brothels in the concentration camps, the lie that cost thousands of lives. The systematic abuse and sexual servitude within the concentration camps began in the year 1942 with the establishment of brothels in Mauthausen and Gusen. The women who were forced to work there came mostly from Ravensbrück, a camp designated for female prisoners. Women were also selected for other similar facilities in Monowitz, Auschwitz and Mittelbau-Dora, using different recruitment methods. In Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, Nazi officers identified those destined for extremely demanding labor, such as construction. They were offered a supposed option, a transfer to the brothels with the deceptive promise that, after 6 months, they would obtain freedom. However, this commitment was never fulfilled. This persuasion strategy was mainly directed at young German women labeled as undesirable, and women who, before the war, had engaged in prostitution. Their choice was limited, except an uncertain opportunity to survive or face almost certain death. The testimony of a Polish prisoner in Auschwitz-Birkenau reflects the desperation behind these decisions. She decided to volunteer when Commander Hössler asked those interested to step forward. When questioned by another prisoner about her determination, she replied that with the arrival of winter and the extreme conditions in forced labor, it was impossible to imagine surviving another season in Auschwitz. For her, submitting to systematic abuse was less terrifying than the crematorium. Liana Milou, an Italian survivor and author, defended those who made this difficult decision. In her writings, she exposed her struggle to cling to life and rejected the moral condemnation of those who tried to survive in any way possible. I did not want to vanish without a trace. My only wish was to return home. I was barely 18 years old and did not intend to die. While others searched the trash for food scraps, was I expected to reject the possibility of living just because the price was disgraceful? Besides the brothels intended for prisoners, the SS also sought Polish women in Ravensbrück for another purpose, to exploit them in establishments created specifically for the Ukrainian SS guards. These guards were prohibited from having any kind of relationship with German women due to the racial laws of the regime. As a result, exclusive enclosures were established for them in camps such as Flossenbürg, Buchenwald, Gusen, and possibly Sachsenhausen. As the demand for these spaces grew, the Nazis intensified their search for new victims. During the daily roll calls in the camps, officers carefully analyzed the prisoners and selected those they deemed suitable for this role. In the year 1943, for example, in Ravensbrück, a German woman named Magdalena B. was selected along with other prisoners to be transferred to Buchenwald. Instead of being sent to their usual tasks, they were taken before the camp commander, Max Kögel, and the chief supervisor, as well as the leader of Buchenwald, Hermann Peister. There, the officials chose the ones they wanted, recorded their prisoner numbers, and took them to the infirmary. Once there, they were forced to undress in front of the Nazi officers and subjected to the administration of chemical substances. After a period of isolation, they were given civilian clothing and transported to Weimar in conventional trains, then transferred in military trucks to their final destination, the Buchenwald concentration camp. The homosexual Nazi leader, betrayal, purge and death in the night of the long knives. Nazi rhetoric often differed significantly from its actions, and its stance on homosexuality was no exception. This was especially evident within the upper ranks of the regime, whose members enjoyed considerable freedom to engage in officially censured behaviors without facing the same consequences as the common citizen. A prominent example is Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA and a key figure in the consolidation of the Nazi movement. Under his command, the SA operated as a paramilitary group dedicated to persecuting those who did not align with the party's ideology. Intellectuals and workers accused of communism, people of Jewish origin from various social strata, and those suspected of homosexuality were targeted by this organization. Its members were expected to embody the ideals of masculinity promoted by the regime: bravery, physical strength, absolute loyalty, recklessness, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for the Nazi cause. However, a contradiction existed within the SA. Its top leader, Ernst Röhm, did not hide his homosexuality. Numerous documents indicate that Hitler was aware of this, but chose to ignore it or simply did not consider it important. In the year 1931, a leftist-leaning newspaper publicly exposed that Röhm, the imposing leader of the violent organization, maintained relationships with other men. Despite the controversy, this did not affect his relationship with Hitler. When Hitler finally obtained conclusive evidence of Röhm's homosexuality, he downplayed the matter. In the year 1932, an accusation arose that the SA chief had attempted to seduce a close associate of the Führer. In response to this situation, the Nazi leader attributed Röhm's orientation to a temporary condition contracted during his stay in the tropics, particularly in the period when he organized Bolivia's military forces. In this context, Hitler almost justified his behavior, stating that the private life of the SA commander was not a matter of public interest. However, the situation changed when the SA increased its influence and began generating conflicts with the SS and even with Hitler's own plans. While Himmler claimed that Röhm's downfall was due to his homosexuality, the reality was that his paramilitary organization had become an obstacle within the fragile balance of power in the Nazi regime. The SA had the support of common men, mostly heterosexuals of middle age, who wanted to be part of Germany's transformation and were willing to risk everything. In a way, they represented a radical faction within the movement, something that, with the progressive bureaucratization of the state and its merger with the party, became unacceptable. The elimination of this faction became inevitable, and Röhm's sexual orientation served as a perfect excuse for his adversaries. For this reason, Himmler ordered the SS and the Gestapo, the secret police, to carry out a violent purge within the party. Between the 30th of June and the 2nd of July of the year 1934, the event known as the Night of the Long Knives took place. Röhm was murdered along with other leaders, and it is estimated that up to 150 people died, while hundreds more were arrested and subjected to torture. The invisible horror, the Buchenwald brothel and systematic exploitation. In the Buchenwald camp, the brothel was located in a wooden barrack. It had a common area, a room for the SS guard, a medical space and several small rooms called Coverzimmer, as well as dormitories where each pair of female prisoners shared a space. The women wore white plaid skirts, with the option of wearing a bra and underwear underneath. Their routine began at 7:30 in the morning, when they had to wash and get dressed. Among their daily obligations were keeping the barrack clean and ventilating the rooms. They were also allowed to access certain books from the library, as long as they did not cover political topics, as Magdalena Walter recalled. However, this apparent normalcy concealed a devastating truth. Their days passed between repetitive tasks and the anguish of the 2 nightly hours, the time when prisoners finished their workday and went to the brothel. Magdalena described this process as a kind of assembly line. Every night the men entered, first passing through the medical room where they received an injection, then entering the room with the women and remaining there no more than 15 minutes. Upon leaving, they returned to the medical area for another injection before leaving the brothel. The work pace was relentless, allowing barely any rest. Initially, Magdalena tried to resist and threatened to attack the first man who approached her with a pair of nail scissors. However, her time in Ravensbrück had broken her spirit, and the constant violence in Buchenwald plunged her into apathy. In the end, she stopped fighting, falling into a mental state similar to that of so many prisoners who had lost all hope. Despite everything, Magdalena Walter managed to leave Buchenwald at the end of the year 1944. However, the reasons behind her release remain unclear. Sex, surveillance, and terror, the Nazi machinery behind the brothels in the concentration camps. The surveillance and supervision of the brothels in the concentration camps were meticulously organized, according to the German sociologist Wolfgang Sofsky in his work, The Order of Terror. The camps were spaces designed to shape behaviors and social relationships through the absolute control of time and space. This was reflected in the strict administration of these places, where monitoring was constant and violence extreme. Initially, the brothels called Sonderbauten were installed near the entrances of camps such as Mauthausen, Gusen, and Auschwitz. However, a later directive ordered their relocation to more remote areas, generally near the medical blocks. Examples of this were seen in Flossenbürg, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and Neuengamme. The reason for this relocation responded to practical needs. The SS wanted to keep them out of sight from the other prisoners. Additionally, since their administration was often linked to the medical management of the camp, proximity to these facilities was convenient. The brothels were placed in secluded and gloomy sectors, generally near areas associated with death and suffering. This allowed the SS to isolate them even further from the rest of the camp. The barracks that housed them were surrounded by fences and guarded by sentries stationed at the entrance, reinforcing their segregation and control. The interior was designed to ensure constant supervision. Most of these barracks were standard wooden structures with a central corridor running through the entire building, facilitating the guards' ability to monitor every movement inside. In Auschwitz, the design of the Sonderbau reflected the architecture of Block 11, one of the most feared prisons in the camp, demonstrating the SS's obsession with control and discipline. Access to these brothels by male prisoners was subject to a meticulous procedure. First, they had to request authorization from the camp administration and register in the administrative office known as Schreibstube. If the request was approved by the camp commander, the prisoner's name was announced during the evening roll call. In Flossenbürg, for example, prisoners who obtained permission were taken in pairs after roll call and had to wait their turn in line in front of the brothel barrack. Jakub Peck, a Polish survivor who arrived at Auschwitz at only 19 years old and worked as the personal barber of Commander Rudolf Höss, described how this system operated. When a brothel began operating in the camp, the responsible officer distributed coupons among certain prisoners. Peck recalled that the camp barbers received tickets and had to line up in the corridor after undergoing a mandatory medical examination. High-ranking officers, including Commander Höss himself, were often present during these visits. Orders such as "Attention" and "Salute to Hitler" were given as prisoners waited in line for their turn. Peck received a coupon with the number 9 and was instructed to stand outside the corresponding room, waiting to enter along with the others. The time allowed for each male prisoner inside the brothel was extremely limited. Normally, only 15 minutes were granted. Only conventional intercourse in the missionary position was permitted, and entering the bed with shoes on was strictly prohibited. To ensure compliance with these rules, the SS guards observed the activities through small openings in the doors. When the assigned time ran out, a bell rang as a signal to leave. If a prisoner delayed in exiting, a guard would enter and force him to leave, often using physical force. Before leaving the Sonderbau, each prisoner had to report to the camp infirmary to receive a prophylactic injection. Despite the strict rules imposed, control was not absolute. Some women found ways to defy the regulations, such as blocking the guards' view by covering the peepholes with adhesive tape. Occasionally, they established connections with prisoners who had better conditions within the camp, forging alliances that provided them with a certain degree of protection. The historian Anna Haikova identified these connections as rational relationships, a survival strategy observed not only in Auschwitz-Birkenau, but also in ghettos such as Theresienstadt. In these calculated relationships, men offered support in the form of food or security, while women provided sexual favors. This exchange was not limited to Auschwitz. In other camps such as Buchenwald, prisoners could offer extra rations or bribe fellow inmates to prevent certain women from being visited by others. To prevent the consolidation of these bonds, the SS frequently changed the women's rooms, making it difficult for prisoners to know whom they would encounter. The opening of the brothel in Auschwitz led to a boom in the black market within the camp. Prisoners smuggled valuables and clothing taken from Canada, the warehouse where the belongings of Jews murdered in the gas chambers were stored, intending to gain the favor of the women in the brothel. Some prisoners even risked their lives by attempting to visit their lovers during nighttime hours. If they were discovered by the SS, the consequences could be deadly. To prevent these clandestine incursions, the guards implemented measures such as locking the women in a special dormitory or reassigning them to other areas of the camp, thereby eliminating any possibility of contact with the male prisoners. The Auschwitz brothel, Rudolf Höss's macabre experiment. It is difficult to conceive that sexual instinct could persist under extreme conditions, in an environment dominated by fear, lack of food, and the constant danger of death. However, the accounts of those who survived reveal a more complex reality. Jack Terry, who managed to survive the Flossenburg camp, emphasized that the need to eat and the drive to stay alive outweighed any other need. Similarly, the psychologist Viktor Frankl, a prisoner in Auschwitz, wrote after his liberation that his sexual desire was practically suppressed, explaining this sensation with a metaphor. Hunger absorbed every other basic instinct, which he described as a form of stomach masturbation. However, these perspectives do not reflect the entirety of experiences within the camps. In the year 1971, the German psychiatrist Paul Matusek published a study in which he asserted that the absence of sexual desire, as described by Frankl, was not a universal phenomenon. One of the survivors interviewed stated that, despite his state of starvation, he intensely longed for sexual activity, and that several prisoners in Dachau had erotic dreams and resorted to self-satisfaction. This same witness confessed that, in secret, he wished to visit the camp brothel. For his part, Ernst Federn, who endured imprisonment in Buchenwald and later became a psychologist, asserted that sexuality continued to play an important role for certain prisoners. According to him, for some inmates, desire and intimacy did not disappear, but instead became part of their experience in the camps. While these accounts may seem contradictory, they become understandable when analyzing the differences in prisoners' conditions. The survival circumstances in Dachau and Buchenwald were less severe compared to the horrors of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Mauthausen or Majdanek. Wolfgang Sofsky described the concentration camps as environments of extreme inequality. While many captives lived in absolute misery, others, due to their position within the system, had access to better conditions. The self-management strategy imposed by the SS ensured that certain prisoners were granted small quotas of power to collaborate in the administration of the camp, mostly selected based on Nazi racial and political ideologies. This hierarchical structure had a direct impact on survival chances. From the moment a person arrived at a camp, they completely lost their identity. Their names were replaced by numbers, and from that moment, a process of both physical and psychological dehumanization began. One of the most cruel aspects of this system was the elimination of any expression of gender. All body hair was shaved, and personal belongings were confiscated, marking the beginning of a forced transformation. Prolonged food deprivation had devastating effects on the body. Women stopped menstruating, and their bodies, weakened to the extreme, were reduced to a dwindling reserve of energy. Samuel Pisar recounted that in Auschwitz-Birkenau, men and women crossed paths without feeling the slightest sexual interest. For most, shame and desire were replaced by a survival instinct that nullified any other emotion. One of the fundamental elements of the horror suffered by prisoners was the loss of their sexual identity, affecting both genders, though with a greater impact on women, according to the testimonies of some female survivors. This process was not merely a collateral effect of life in the camps, but a premeditated tactic used by the Nazis to subjugate and strip the prisoners of their humanity. Despite the devastating impact of the camp conditions, some prisoners managed to adapt to the brutal reality in which they were immersed, while others did not survive. For those who found a way to endure their situation, reclaiming some sense of sexual identity became a key strategy of resistance. It has been observed that status within the social structure of the camp influenced the sexual life of the prisoners. The better the assigned work group or the higher the rank within the administrative prisoner system, the greater the possibility of accessing resources such as food through exchange, making sexuality a more relevant aspect of their lives. Before barracks designated for sexual commerce were established, predominantly male concentration camps lacked a female presence. For many of the male prisoners, especially those who had been captured after the Nazi regime came to power in the year 1933, the possibility of seeing a woman was extremely rare. For this reason, the introduction of women for the brothels in the camps caused a great stir. In Auschwitz-Monowitz, for example, the barrack designated for this activity was located in the center of the camp, occasionally allowing the women to be seen by the male prisoners outside. In Auschwitz-Stammlager, the brothel was located in Block 24, near the main entrance of the camp, just below the infamous slogan Arbeit macht frei. Although the existence of these places was an open secret, most prisoners had access only to fragmented information, based more on rumors than direct experiences. In Mittelbau-Dora, for example, the brothel barrack was located in the same building that housed the camp library, directly above the square where prisoners were forced to form daily lines. From there, the women could be seen standing at the entrance or looking out the windows, a deliberate strategy by the SS to attract the gaze of male prisoners. However, for the majority of captives, the existence of these brothels held no relevance in their daily struggle for survival. In reality, these places were primarily accessible to prisoners who held positions within the camp's hierarchy, highlighting the close relationship between access to certain privileges, power and survival within the concentration camp system. The number of inmates who frequented these brothels was surprisingly low in relation to the total camp population. In Auschwitz-Stammlager, for example, when there were around 30,000 prisoners in the camp, barely 100 visited these barracks, representing only 0.33% of the total prisoner population. Similarly, in Buchenwald, when the brothel began operating in July of the year 1943, an average of 98 prisoners visited on the days it was open, which amounted to approximately 0.77% of the camp population. Several factors explained the low attendance at these places, including the extreme living conditions and the physical and psychological impact of the camp's brutality on the prisoners. To access the brothel, one had to belong to a select group of prisoners, as only some were permitted entry. This access was exclusively restricted to those considered Aryan, which included nationals from Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and Spain. In contrast, Jews and Soviet prisoners of war were completely banned, as their imprisonment was intended for extermination. Beyond racial classification, another essential requirement was possessing the necessary bonus coupons to pay for entry. However, these vouchers were not regularly distributed, so those interested in obtaining them had to resort to the black market or have connections with those who managed their distribution. Finally, meeting the administrative requirements was not enough. It was also essential to be in the physical condition and emotional disposition to attend, further reducing the number of prisoners who could take advantage of this possibility. Himmler's brothels, Nazi sex. The people who frequented the brothel usually held the highest positions in the prisoner hierarchy. Among them were block supervisors, labor command chiefs, elderly prisoners with some authority, and those assigned to privileged detachments, such as the camp's internal police, firefighting brigades, kitchen staff, barbers, medical workers, and butchery supervisors. Testimonies, as well as the visitor logbook from the brothel of Block TR in Mauthausen, have provided more details about the social status of those who attended and the frequency of their visits. Generally speaking, they could be divided into three categories: those who attended regularly, those who went only occasionally or once, and those who were forcibly taken there by the SS. The group of regular visitors was quite small and was mostly made up of prisoners with high ranks within the camp's internal organization, known as the local aristocracy. The detailed record from the brothel of Block 3 in Mauthausen lists names, prisoner numbers, and attendance dates, covering from June to December of the year 1942. Of the 90 prisoners listed, 57 accessed this place. When examining in greater detail the number of times they attended, it is observed that only 19 of them were frequent clients, some visiting up to 2 times in a single week. Other camp documents, such as lists of prisoners authorized to carry watches or individual inmate records, help identify the roles and positions of these visitors within the camp's structure. Among them were detachment chiefs in the quarry, in the SS mechanical workshop, or in the disinfection area. There were also those who performed administrative or service functions, such as cooks, cleaning staff in the commander's offices, postal workers in the camp's post office, or clerks in the blocks. These occupations, in addition to being physically less demanding, provided access to food and coveted goods, making them highly desirable positions. At that time, the bonus voucher system had not yet been implemented, so access to the brothel required arranging payment through other means, either by exchanging goods or using other mechanisms within the camp's underground economy. These interactions reflect how social dynamics and survival strategies were organized within the prison system. The prisoners with the most influence, known as camp notables, had privileges unimaginable to most inmates. They had money and valuables that were forbidden to others, owned more than one pair of shoes when most had only one, and participated in recreational activities that included high-stakes card games, sports events, and even musical evenings on weekends. These privileges were also reflected in their private lives. Although homosexuality was prohibited in the camps, some of the highest-ranking prisoners maintained relationships with young men or adolescents. For the Lager Prominents, sexuality was not only an aspect of their privileged lifestyle, but also a manifestation of dominance and prestige. Their indifference to the misery of others was evident both in the way they wasted food in front of starving prisoners and in their ostentation of sexual vigor. Another large group of brothel visitors consisted of prisoners with an intermediate status within the camp. Unlike those of higher rank, most of these men attended only occasionally or just once, driven by different reasons. For them, the motivation was not excess, but the attempt to reclaim a part of their identity and masculinity in an environment that constantly dehumanized them. In the year 1973, the Polish researchers Giza and Moreau published a study based on surveys conducted between the years 1964 and 1962, analyzing the sexual life of inmates in Auschwitz. They found that male prisoners rarely engaged in masturbation, with an approximate frequency of once every 2 or 3 months. More than an act of pleasure, it was a way to reaffirm their existence and strength. Similarly, many men saw the brothels as an opportunity to determine if they were still capable of feeling something, if their male identity remained intact after all the suffering they had endured. For some of the young men who arrived at the camps without having had previous sexual experiences, the possibility of not surviving led them to seek at least one intimate encounter before dying. Johann F.B., a prisoner of Auschwitz who worked as a translator for the Gestapo, received a bonus voucher from a friend who worked in the butcher group. His companion encouraged him to visit the brothel, insisting that he had never been with a woman. Johann accepted, but once inside he decided only to talk with the woman instead of engaging physically. The brothels within the camps reflected the same dynamics of control, power and dehumanization that governed the prisoners' lives. One case that illustrates this reality is that of an 18-year-old Czech youth who arrived at Mauthausen. His only chance of survival was to depend on the protection of a higher-ranking prisoner, in exchange for which he had to grant sexual favors. Confused about what this meant for his identity, he decided to visit the brothel to clarify his feelings. However, like others in his situation, once inside he was unable to carry out any sexual act. The testimonies of victims forced into prostitution in the concentration camp brothels reveal that sexual dysfunction was common among prisoners. Several factors explained this situation: the extreme deterioration of physical health, the oppressive and ruthless environment that suppressed any natural impulse, and the prolonged absence of contact with women. For many, going to the SPAO did not mean an interest in having sexual relations, but rather a search for human interaction. Frequently, inmates visited only with the intention of conversing with a woman, desiring a minimal sense of closeness and normality in an environment where such contact was almost non-existent. A third group of prisoners who attended these brothels did so against their will, being sent by the SS. At times, the Nazis used these encounters as a form of rewarding certain inmates, even if they did not wish to participate. However, refusing the invitation could bring reprisals. One of the documented cases is that of Mikol Zak, who was a prisoner in Monowitz. He recounted how a camp officer decided to reward a multilingual worker who was fluent in German and collaborated with IG Farben. This man, an elderly political prisoner, had no intention of attending the brothel but had no choice. Another episode of imposed visits involved Erich Resker, Lagerälteste of Buchenwald, and a key figure in the camp's commercial structure. Nazi officers forced him to inaugurate the brothel as a symbol of his position within the prisoners' internal hierarchy. Far from being a privilege, this action reflected the total control that the SS exercised, even over those with a high status within the camp. Any concession was subject to the will of Nazi officials, thus reaffirming their absolute dominance. A particularly striking testimony comes from Jean-Michel, a survivor of the Mel-Bode-Dora camp. In his autobiography, he recounts the experience of his companion Dear, who suffered a traumatic situation after an exhausting workday in the contained tunnels where armaments were manufactured. Michel describes the event in detail. After 12 hours of grueling labor, Dear and his team returned to the camp in a state of extreme exhaustion. Unexpectedly, the SS intercepted them and led them to a barrack transformed into a brothel. Disoriented and with the sole aspiration of sleeping, the men were in shock upon receiving the order. With no other alternative, they lined up in front of the building, each one placed before a closed door. They were ordered to lower their pants, while on the other side, the women waited, trapped in the same nightmare. After this first instruction, a second order was given. They had to enter. They did so, with their pants half down and entirely devoid of desire. The scene was comparable to the apathy of a sick elderly man, incapable of experiencing any interest. One of them found himself face to face with a woman, feeling how shame and confusion overwhelmed him even more. Michel describes how Dear, between humiliation and the absurdity of the situation, made an ironic remark about the reputation of the French in the sexual sphere, subtly suggesting how these forced encounters contradicted old stereotypes. Hitler and sex, the rumors about the Führer's intimacy. Hitler's sex life has been the subject of constant speculation by historians, more so than in the case of other dictators. This is mainly due to the mystery that surrounded it. For example, while Stalin seemed to have led an uneventful, intimate life, and Mussolini was famous for his numerous romantic conquests, to the point of dying alongside his lover instead of his wife, the private side of the Führer was much more enigmatic. For years he cultivated a dual image. On one hand, an attractive man to young women, and on the other, someone who lived with total austerity. In January of the year 1937, Reinhard Spitzy, who advised the German ambassador in London, Joachim von Ribbentrop, accompanied the latter to meet with Hitler. As a member of the SA and the SS, Spitzy felt true devotion to the German leader, seeing him as an almost mythical being, an untouchable figure. During their conversation, Spitzy remained motionless while the discussion extended for hours. At an unexpected moment, a young woman with curly hair burst into the room and interrupted him, demanding that he immediately attend lunch with his guests. Spitzy was paralyzed, unable to process that someone would address the Führer in such a manner. Shortly afterward, Hitler's personal assistant Bruckner warned him not to speak about what he had seen, as doing so could cost him his life. With a somewhat understanding tone, he explained that although Hitler was the leader of Germany, he also had the right to a private life. For Spitzy, the impact was enormous. He had always imagined Hitler as someone devoid of any carnal desire, a man completely devoted to his political mission. That day he realized that Hitler had a romantic relationship, which implied that he led an active sex life. In the year 1936, Hitler attended a meeting of the National Socialist Women's Association, where he gave a speech acknowledging that the party's success would not have been possible without the loyalty and constant effort of the women who supported the movement. He declared that those who carried National Socialism in their souls were bound to him perpetually. Additionally, he stated that the children born of these mothers justified his work and, in a chilling tone, asserted that those children did not belong solely to their mothers, but also to him. In reality, Hitler was proposing a kind of symbolic union with all women, especially those capable of bearing children within the Reich. He expected their total commitment and demanded absolute fidelity. From his perspective, children belonged to the state as much as they did to their own families. However, beyond these propagandistic ideals, Hitler also sought to justify his marital status to the female public of Germany, who were curious about his romantic situation. He provided an explanation in an informal meeting in January of the year 1942, during a tea party at his headquarters in East Prussia. When asked why he did not have a wife, he replied that his role as leader of the Third Reich left him no time for a relationship of that nature. He also mentioned that the problem with marriage lay in the legal obligations it entailed, something for which he had neither the interest nor the availability. He considered marriage an obsolete institution and preferred to maintain romantic relationships without formal commitments. He believed that the ideal arrangement was to enjoy companionship without being trapped in legal obligations. His views on marriage explain why, despite Eva Braun's numerous requests to formalize their relationship, he never agreed. To him, a wife represented a potential weakness. Eva, who fit his concept of ideal femininity with her light hair, love of sports and impressionable nature, was not the reason for his refusal. Simply put, Hitler did not see marriage as necessary in his life. In the year 1932, Eva, desperate over Hitler's indifference and his constant absences, made a drastic decision. She left a few hastily written lines and, with a weapon in hand, attempted to shoot herself. However, she did not succeed in her intent. Years later, when Soviet forces were rapidly advancing on Berlin and defeat was imminent, Hitler, Eva, and the high-ranking Nazi officials took refuge in underground complexes. Aware that the end was near, the Führer decided to fulfill a wish that Eva had expressed on numerous occasions. As a gesture of recognition for her unwavering loyalty, he ordered his secretary, Martin Bormann, to organize a discreet legal ceremony. Amid concrete walls and far from any lavish celebration, they formalized their union through a brief civil ceremony. The circumstances were extreme, but the somber atmosphere did not matter. The next day, their fate was already sealed. Paris. 1940. Brothels under the Nazi occupation. The summer of 1940 was a devastating blow to French pride. It was no wonder, as a country that had once been a European power under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte had to witness how, in that year, the Wehrmacht managed to break through the seemingly impregnable Maginot Line. The Germans, amid jokes and plates of sauerkraut, advanced with their tanks into the streets of Paris and stopped before the iconic Eiffel Tower. From that moment on, a period of occupation began in which two realities were forced to coexist on French territory. On one side, the collaborators who sought to gain some benefit from the invaders, and on the other, the famous resistance, whose effectiveness was largely driven by the propaganda of Charles de Gaulle. The brothels of the French capital chose the first path. According to Patrick Buisson in his work 1940 to 1945, Erotic Years, Vichy or the Misfortunes of Virtue, the owners of these establishments did not hesitate to enthusiastically welcome Nazi soldiers as long as it meant economic profits. The decision proved to be extremely profitable. In fact, after the war ended, several of them confessed that they had never seen as high an income as that provided by the clients of the Third Reich. For French brothels, the arrival of the German occupiers marked a new era of prosperity. However, within the world of prostitution in Paris, one establishment stood out above the rest and became the favorite site of the Nazi high command due to its exclusivity, Le Chabanais. This brothel, with nearly a century of history and located near the Louvre Museum, concealed multiple secrets within its walls. It had rooms decorated according to various themes and, among its curiosities, housed an unusual love chair designed specifically for King Edward VII. The women who worked in this place took pride in belonging to the elite, and consequently their fees were considerably high. The epicenter of France's most refined debauchery opened its doors in 1878 at number 12 Rue Chabanais, taking its name from the same street. Today, tracing its history is difficult. According to Marc Lemonnier in his historical guide to Libertine Paris, the facade of this brothel did not attract attention, as it was a 7-story building that, at first glance, blended in with the other structures in the neighborhood. Its founder was known as Madame Kelly, though later the business passed into the hands of Ney Pointu, Ernest Le Sourd, and Georges Le Cuirassier. Although its exterior was not particularly striking, the reputation of this brothel quickly grew, attracting Parisian society thanks to its fame as a cosmopolitan establishment. A sign at the entrance announced its motto, "A place for all nations." However, this phrase did not refer to the origin of the workers, but rather to the ambience of its rooms, which transported clients to exotic settings. Among the most remembered by scholars are the Hindu-themed room, one inspired by Moorish culture, another decorated in the style of Pompeii, and even one with medieval motifs. At the Universal Exposition in Paris in the year 1900, the Japanese-style room received an award, further contributing to the establishment's reputation. The exclusive brothel Le Chabanais had around 20 rooms, built with a high budget. Its greatest attraction was the extravagance of its luxury. A clear example of this is that the artist Charles Touchet, an expert in frescoes, spent an entire year beautifying its interior. Rooms such as the Louis XVI style chamber were designed by renowned decorators and adorned with high-quality materials. But this sophistication came at a high cost, so much so that during the Second World War, a single encounter equaled the weekly salary of a high-ranking officer. In terms of operation, Le Chabanais initially had around 22 women carefully selected by the administration. However, the number quickly increased to 36 with the Universal Exposition held in Paris in 1878. All of them shared the few available beds, in many cases sleeping in pairs. Although in the year 1883 a City Hall report criticized this practice, the brothel's popularity was so great that authorities chose to ignore the issue rather than create conflicts with its owners. The influence of this establishment became evident when its workers began distributing advertisements on the streets of Paris to promote the business, despite the fact that since the year 1880, regulations had prohibited such advertisements, considering them inappropriate. But the reality was that by then, the place no longer needed promotion, as its fame had already spread throughout French territory. Historian Brigitte Rochelandet mentions in her work Les Maisons Closes Autrefois that its renown was so great that other brothels adopted the same name as a marketing strategy. In several cities such as Calais, Lille, Marseille, Nancy, Toulon and Fréjus, establishments called Chabanais emerged. However, the authentic and original one was always in Paris. The refinement of its facilities not only raised the cost of services, but also turned Le Chabanais into a meeting point for the aristocracy. According to Lemonier's testimony, it was common for influential figures and even members of royalty to reserve time in their schedules to visit the brothel. To maintain discretion, visits were recorded with the phrase, "meeting with the President of the Senate." It was not just about intimate encounters. The site also offered an entertainment atmosphere with drinks, music, and gambling. Over time, the brothel welcomed various personalities from the world of art and politics. Among its most well-known clients was Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, who, besides frequenting the place, contributed to decorating some of the rooms. Also, the writer Guy de Maupassant, who even built a Moorish-themed room in his home to recall the brothel's ambience. Other celebrities such as actress Mae West and the iconic Cary Grant also passed through its halls. The exclusivity of the place was so well recognized that luxury tourism agencies offered it as an exclusive experience for their most distinguished clients. This was explained by Nicole Canet, a collector of artifacts from the establishment, in an interview for The Telegraph. With the arrival of the German army in the year 1940 and its advance over France, Parisian brothels experienced an abrupt change. In places like Le Chabanais and the prestigious 122, known for their luxury, many women left their jobs, some out of fear of what was to come, others as an act of defiance against the occupiers. It was not uncommon to see signs hanging on the doors of these establishments with a clear and defiant message for Nazi officers: "Closed, staff mobilized." This form of peaceful resistance quickly crumbled. As soon as the Germans decided to reopen the brothels and organize their use according to military hierarchy, the situation changed. From that moment on, German money became an incentive for the workers in these establishments to agree to serve the new occupiers. The administrator of Le Chabanais stated at the end of the war that Nazi soldiers were a better option than French clients, as they paid generously, were more sophisticated, spoke several languages, and displayed refined manners. With the massive influx of Reich banknotes, the number of women willing to engage in prostitution in the French capital reached 10,000, a figure far exceeding the 4,000 recorded at the beginning of the conflict. German control fully reactivated these pleasure establishments, which experienced an unprecedented boom. From the luxurious 122, whose grand hall with erotic frescoes fascinated the Nazi elite, to the more modest brothels intended for the troops, all benefited. Le Chabanais, as expected, was reserved exclusively for the German military high command, including prominent members of the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, and the SS. Of the 177 brothels and entertainment centers distributed across the Seine area, 5 were assigned to officers and 18 to soldiers. Bilingual signs at the entrance indicated this classification, explains Buisson. This iconic brothel fell under the control of key figures in the Nazi regime, among them Hermann Göring, although he preferred to frequent the exclusive 122. There, officers of the Third Reich organized lavish nighttime gatherings, while the French population faced a curfew-restricting movement between 11 at night and 5 in the morning. During these celebrations, coveted items such as chocolate, tobacco, and champagne were distributed among the workers, who performed seductive dance shows and participated in gambling. The evening usually culminated when one of the attendees suggested moving to the themed rooms to continue the fun in private. The use of sex as a tool of domination in the Third Reich exposed the brutality of a regime that sought absolute control over every aspect of life. In the concentration camps, brothels were not spaces of privilege but rather another form of subjugation. The women forced to work in them were stripped of all autonomy, while the prisoners who visited these places did so under the strict surveillance of the SS, subjected to regulations that erased any trace of humanity. Outside the camps, the Nazi occupation of France brought with it the adaptation of exclusive brothels for the Reich's elite. While the Nazis imposed restrictions on the local population, their officers indulged in excess and corruption, reflecting the hypocrisy of a regime that promoted racial purity while its leadership sank into decadence. Within the Nazi power structure itself, sexuality was used as a political weapon. Homosexuality, tolerated in certain sectors while fiercely persecuted in others, served as a pretext to eliminate inconvenient figures within the party, as occurred with Ernst Röhm during the Night of the Long Knives. Nazism instrumentalized sexuality with meticulous precision, in the camps as a method of control and humiliation, in occupied society as a means of domination over the population, and within the party itself as a tool for consolidating power. From the barracks of the brothels to the halls of the Nazi elite, sex was a tool of oppression that revealed the true nature of the regime. The horror of Nazism was not only manifested in mass extermination, but also in the systematic degradation of human dignity, where even desire was turned into a form of control.